So I've been asked to come here today, to come to Liverpool, and I am thrilled to be here. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about my sort of journey, some of the things I learned along the way, and how it might be able to help you all or contribute to your work. And when I talk about my journey, I'm mainly talking about the publication of my book, High Price. This is the cover of High Price, the U.S. version cover of High Price. It's a picture of me sitting on a bench in some park. And this is the UK's version of High Price. I think that these sort of photos kind of give you an idea of how the various countries now see drugs. This UK photo it looks like a bad episode of the television program Cops. It's awful. But this is what they see in terms of drugs. This is about my story, a neuroscientist who is an academic and tries to talk about drugs in a way that is academic but yet accessible. And these idiots at Penguin Publishing put this picture on the book. And I think this says something about how folks, it says something about the level of the discourse in your country now. I think that and rarely do I say in the U.S. that we have more progress than anyone. But on this issue, I think you all may have led originally, but now this is, I don't know how well it is. But anyway, I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my story. And what I like to do is talk about the book for the most part. And when I talk about the book, it's a memoir, a science book, and make some policy recommendations as well. And I want to do this by asking you to come along with me on a journey so you can see how I have evolved in my thinking about drugs. And then hopefully it could be used as a tool to help other people evolve, because just based on the brilliant conversations and discussions and presentations earlier this morning from Jerry, Sarah, and Magdalena, excellent presentation. It seems as though you all have already evolved, but I'm asking you to come back with me back to the 1980s, if you will. I know some of you all look like you've been there and beyond, but for the others, please join me back in the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, it was a time when Thatcher and Reagan, they were making the world a nervous wreck. Maybe some of you all remember this time. This is a photo from Spitting Images. The Spitting Images still come on? Does that no longer comes on? But I know about that show because I spent about 3 years here in the UK. I was in the U.S. military in the Air Force, and I was stationed at RAF Fairford. That's in Gloucestershire. So some of you all may know Fairford, and I lived in Swindon, and I played basketball for the Swindon Rakers and the Swindon Bullets. So if you all know anything about basketball, so I was Swindon Town's in the house. So when I was in the military, one of the things that you all should know is that I went to the military after having a sort of shady, if you would, adolescence where I sold drugs, used drugs, participated in petty crime. I engaged in a lot of questionable behavior and so forth. And so when I came to the UK, one of the things I started to do also was to go to university while in the military and started to learn how to think a little bit. And then I started to I wanted to make a contribution to my community. I wanted to make sure that I was not a burden as I saw myself being when I was selling drugs and using drugs. That's the way I saw it. And at the time, in the 80s, what was critically important, or what was going on in the U.S. that was a big deal, was crack cocaine kind of hit the market in the mid-1980s, 1985, 1986. It was so important, crack cocaine, or we were so concerned about crack cocaine, that our president, Ronald Reagan, called a national sort of press conference where he had the ear of the nation. And he wanted to tell the nation about this new form of cocaine. And I just want to show you a clip to help us get back in that time, if you will.
Today, there's a new epidemic, smokable cocaine. otherwise known as crack. It is an explosively destructive and often lethal substance which is crushing its users. It is an uncontrolled fire. And drug abuse is not a so-called victimless crime. Everyone's safety is at stake when drugs and excessive alcohol are used by people on the highways or by those transporting our citizens or operating industrial equipment. Drug abuse costs you and your fellow Americans at least $60 billion a year. From the early days of our administration, Nancy has been intensely involved in the effort to fight drug abuse.
I'm especially concerned about what drugs are doing to young mothers and their newborn children. Listen to this news account from a hospital in Florida of a child born to a mother with a cocaine habit. Nearby, a baby named Paul lies motionless in an incubator, feeding tubes riddling his tiny body. He needs a respirator to breathe and a daily spinal tap to relieve fluid buildup on his brain. Only 1 month old, he's already suffered 2 strokes. Now you can see why drug abuse concerns every one of us, all the American family. Drugs steal away so much. They take and take until finally, every time a drug goes into a child, something else is forced out, like love and hope and trust and confidence. Drugs take away the dream from every child's heart and replace it with a nightmare. And it's time we in America stand up and replace those dreams. Each of us has to put our principles and consciences on the line, whether in social settings or in the workplace, to set forth solid standards and stick to them. There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use. For the sake of our children, I implore each of you to be unyielding and inflexible in your opposition to drugs.
So are you back with me in 1986? Well, believe it or not, I think you guys are living in 1986 in the UK when it comes to drug policy now. But this is the important point here is that, I mean, I don't want to go through all of the sort of pharmacological inaccuracies that were stated there. But I'm trying to paint a picture for you all, and me being here in the UK thinking about crack cocaine and how it was devastating my community. So I thought, based on this sort of public education, of course, is in quotes, but based on this public education, I thought, something had to be done. And one of the things that was done was that we passed in the United States some of the most restrictive, draconian drug laws that we've ever had in our history. The most important thing about this drug law that we passed in 1986 and then extended in 1988 was the fact that crack cocaine infractions were punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine infractions. That's the important thing. But not only politicians were up in arms and giving speeches and talking about what needed to be done about crack cocaine, it was also in our art. This is just a photo of Gil Scott-Heron on the left and Public Enemy on the right. I can see there are no brothers and sisters in the house, so I may have to say, anybody know who Gil Scott-Heron is? All right, we're in the house. All right, this is Britain. All right. So Gil Scott-Heron, one of my heroes, one of the people who actually got me to learn how to start thinking critically. He used to always talk about the horrors of drugs in his music. The same is true with Public Enemy and how crack cocaine was the major problem. And these are people who had great influence on my thinking, not only about drugs, but just society in general. So I was enthusiastic to follow behind them unquestionably. And at the same time, to illustrate again how concerned we were in the United States about crack cocaine, specifically in the black community, we were so concerned that the NAACP, which is a national, it's an organization called the National Advancement of Colored People. Its mission is to improve the lives of black people in the United States. They teamed up with another organization, the Ku Klux Klan. Some of you all might know the Ku Klux Klan. Their mission statement is a little different than the NAACP's. Their mission statement is white supremacy and to destroy those who are not like them. Crack cocaine was such a concern that the NAACP teamed up with the Ku Klux Klan. That's to give you guys an illustration of how intense this was. And so one of the things I did when I left the UK and left the military was I decided to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, and specifically to focus on drugs of abuse, because I wanted to know how drugs like crack cocaine were exerting their neurobiological effects to make people become addicted. This is what I wanted to do. So I went to school and tried to learn as much as I could, tried to get a good education to figure this problem out, and maybe I could help solve some of the problems that my community faced. But the problem with an education, as James Baldwin has nicely pointed out, the paradox of education, he said, is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. And that happened to me. And that's a problem. Because once you become educated, that means that now you have to question everything and you look at things critically. And you can't just accept what your heroes have said. And you just can't accept what other folks, the authorities, have said. So you have to question. And as I started to question, particularly as we think about crack cocaine, one of the things that I came across in my graduate education was these numbers. This is a graph, of course. The most important thing of this graph, in the black, that's the number, that's the percentage of black people who were prosecuted for crack cocaine violations, which carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison for small amounts of crack. 80%, more than 80% of the people who were convicted under these laws were black in the U.S., even though black people didn't use and don't use crack cocaine or any other form of cocaine more than white people. So these are the kinds of things that got me to start really questioning. And then as I started questioning this sort of data, it made me really think about science and question my own science more so. And as I think about science, this is a picture here of powder cocaine on the left, crack cocaine on the right. If you focus your attention back to the left, powder cocaine, the red circle, that's a hydrochloride portion of powder cocaine. That's the only difference between powder and crack cocaine. That hydrochloride portion doesn't have any pharmacological activity. It doesn't do anything to the pharmacology of the drug. In that, it doesn't have any effects on the body. So now, it is true, the point here is that crack and powder cocaine are the same drug. It is true that when you smoke crack cocaine, the effects are more intense. But that's a function of the route of administration, not the drug itself, because when you intravenously inject powder cocaine dissolved in water, it produces the same sort of intense effects as smoking crack cocaine. So they're the same drug. And these are the sort of things I started to learn as I became better in my science. And then I started to do experiments that would also get at some of the sort of things that were said about crack cocaine, some of the things that provided the justification for punishing it 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. So one of the things that provided the justification for these laws was that people said that crack cocaine was so addictive that the users, once they became addicted to crack cocaine, or once they had a hit of crack cocaine, that the drug would drive them to only seek another hit of the drug, nothing else. And so one of the early experiments that we did, this is very early, we simply brought people into the laboratory, and then they stayed with us while they were in the laboratory course, but then we offered them a choice between a hit of crack cocaine and $5. The hit of crack cocaine was worth more than $5. And we offered them this choice on multiple occasions across several days. We controlled dose, and we did all the proper sort of experimental things. And so the idea, with the logic being that when you bring people who are identified as crack cocaine addicts, by the way, now that term, I understand that term is problematic. I only use that term here to mean people who met criteria according to the ICD-10 or the DSM, and who met criteria for a substance use disorder. That's all I mean. So we brought these folks into the lab and we offered them this choice. And the idea being that these folks, since they are identified as problematic crack cocaine users, if the notion that crack cocaine was so addictive, they would take the crack cocaine hit on every occasion. What we found, this is the amount of time in the blue, is the amount of this is the amount of time they chose the drug, crack cocaine, versus the amount of time they chose the $5. What you see on this slide, this graph, is that they chose drug about half of the occasions and $5 on the other half of occasions. So a small amount of money, like $5, was enough to shift drug-taking behavior at least half of the occasions. Other people have replicated this. We have extended this by doing different types of experiments, but this was the first. And this got me to start thinking about the narrative that we were perpetuating about crack cocaine. Then I started thinking about the epidemiological data and so forth. The vast majority of people who use crack cocaine, or any other drug for that matter, don't have a problem. The vast majority of people use drugs, they go to work, they take care of their families, they handle their responsibility. They are you, they are me. They are the former mayor of Toronto. This is a picture of Rob Ford, of course. Rob Ford recently, they recently elected a new mayor, but Rob Ford, of course, acknowledged using crack cocaine while being in office and so forth. And Rob Ford handled his responsibilities in office to his family and all the rest of those sorts of things. Yeah, I know people will say, well, Rob Ford had some problems. He certainly did. Rob Ford was a jerk. But Rob Ford was a jerk before he used crack cocaine. But not only that, though, Rob Ford had a bigger problem with alcohol. That was his real issue. But the point is that Rob Ford could use crack cocaine and still handle his responsibility, just like most people. Even we, the United States, the last 3 occupants of the White House, they all acknowledged drug use. Of course, Clinton only used marijuana, apparently begrudgingly, but he only used marijuana. Yeah, that's what I mean, begrudgingly. Yeah, let's think about that statement for a second. Bill Clinton said he didn't inhale. Now, if you're smoking weed with somebody, and they are wasting your weed by not inhaling, come on. Now, all right, we'll move on. George Bush, of course, used marijuana, and he's widely suspected of having used cocaine. But Barack Obama used both, and when asked about smoking marijuana, they asked him, did he inhale? He said that was the point. And remember, he also acknowledged his cocaine use, and crack cocaine and powder cocaine, they're the same drug. So I thought like this was an advance in the United States, in that we have these high-level public officials who are responsible. Well, depends. Well, who have served their country, right? They've served their country, and they're acknowledging this. And I thought, this is great. It's helping to normalize drug use, which we know the majority of people who use drugs are not the ones who have problems. And then what I also thought was great was when Barack Obama made strong statements about his disappointment and disapproval of the law that punished crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. He said, when he was running for president, he said that judges think that's wrong, Republicans think that's wrong, Democrats think that's wrong, and yet it's been approved by Republican and Democratic presidents because no one has been willing to brave the politics and make it right. That will change when I'm president. That's what he said. And we were like, wow, all right, let's do this. What happened? Well, in 2010, the law was modified, and President Obama signed it. The law was modified such that crack cocaine is now punished 18 times more harshly than powder cocaine. Now recall that I said they're the same drug. So I make this point because there are a number of people who are on our side, if you will. They've been advocating drug policy reforms, and they are concerned about the way that we have been punishing drug users. And a number of those people gave President Obama a pass, and they saw this as progress. This is what I thought about this. I wrote a piece shortly after this in the Huffington Post, and I quoted Malcolm X when I thought about what had happened. Malcolm X said that if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and then pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. The progress is healing the wound, and that's how I see this. There's no progress. But apparently, President Obama got a pass on this. And so as I think about us giving people passes on these sort of issues, then what it does essentially is that it allows the same behavior to occur in the future. Maybe not with crack cocaine, but maybe with other drugs. And so as I think about other drugs in the United States, one of the other drugs that we're concerned about now is methamphetamine. And many of the sort of myths about crack cocaine have been extended to methamphetamine. I think about those myths. The most popular myths are that methamphetamine has a unique pharmacological profile in that there's never been a drug like methamphetamine. These are the things that we say in the United States. We say that the drug causes brain damage, say it impairs cognitive performance. Now, on this slide, if you focus your attention on the left, this is amphetamine. You all might know it as Adderall in this country. And this is methamphetamine on the right. The only difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine is the methyl group. This methyl group was said to make methamphetamine a lot more dangerous because it is more lipid soluble. Lipid soluble meaning that it gets into the brain more rapidly and has a more rapid effect. And people have said that it increases the abuse potential and a number of things they said about this addition of the methyl group. And it kind of justifies our sort of vilification of the drug. So one of the things that I thought that I do was do a study to actually compare the two drugs in people under double-blind conditions, and that's what we did. I'm going to orient you to this slide here. If you focus your attention on the black, that's placebo. On the light green, that's 12 milligrams amphetamine. Dark green, that's 12 milligrams methamphetamine. Light red, that's 50 milligrams amphetamine. Dark red, that's 50 milligrams methamphetamine. Now, this is the dependent measure that I'm interested in here is systolic blood pressure. That's what the one this is. The comparisons are between the 12 and the 12 and the 50 and the 50. Those are the comparisons that we're making. So if the drug is different, you would see a difference between these two, the light green and the dark green, or the light red and the dark red. Here on systolic blood pressure, what you see is that they exert the same effect. The same is true on diastolic blood pressure. The same is true on heart rate. The same is true on temperature. The same is true on subjective ratings, how high you are, how many good drug effects you have, how stimulated you are, how energetic you are. And we repeated the crack cocaine study where we gave them an opportunity to self-administer or choose to take methamphetamine or amphetamine or $5. So we repeated that study. And when you repeat that study, this is like a behavioral measure of, this is the measure of, this was the gold standard sort of measure. When you repeat that study, what you find is that the drugs are the same. At the larger dose of 50 milligrams, they took drug about half of the occasion and $5 on the other half of the occasion at whether it was methamphetamine or amphetamine. So the bottom line here is that the notion that methamphetamine has a unique pharmacological profile is just simply not supported by evidence from research. Simply not true. What about this issue of brain damage? This is one of the sort of most popular things that we like to do now in science, particularly drug abuse science. One of the things we like to do is put up an image of a brain or two brains like this, and then we like to tell you, the audience, you can see here that methamphetamine causes these horrible effects on your brain. And you, the audience, you typically say, yeah, I can see that, because you're being misled. Let's just talk about this just for 1 second. I just want to tell you what type of image this is. This is a PET image. And in order to get the PET image, this sort of image, what you do is you inject a radioactive compound into someone's body. And in this case, the radioactive compound was raclopride. It binds to dopamine receptors, particularly in the midbrain. And when raclopride, that's been radioactively labeled, binds to these receptors, you can see an image like you see here. That's what's lighting up. The more red, if you will, or the greater the lighting up, the more binding of the raclopride to these dopamine receptors in this region. Now, if you focus your attention on the left, that's a brain from someone who never took methamphetamine. On the right is someone who's been using methamphetamine for a number of years. The idea, what the researcher would tell you, is that you can clearly see there's more lighting up here in the brain here of the non-methamphetamine users than that of the methamphetamine user. Therefore, this indicates that there are fewer dopamine receptors in the methamphetamine user. Therefore, methamphetamine use causes toxicity to dopamine cells. That's why you don't have it lighting up in the brain. Did you guys follow that sort of logical step? Actually, that was illogical, but this is how it plays out. Now, why was it illogical? Now, it's illogical because, first of all, we don't have a measure of, we don't have a direct measure of how well the cells are functioning, whether the cells are there. We don't have a direct measure of that. But I walked you through this like I was definitive in my sort of statement. Now, the fact that we have smaller levels of binding or lighting up in this region, that could happen for a variety of reasons, and it probably should happen if you have someone who's been using methamphetamine for some period of time. One of the things that happens, no matter what drug you use, caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, one of the things that happens is that there is these compensatory mechanisms that occur in our brain. If you have a drug like amphetamine, which releases dopamine quite a bit, you might get downregulation of dopamine receptors, dopamine activity, so forth. That's a compensatory mechanism. That's a normal sort of process. So if you have downregulation, for example, of dopamine receptors, you'll see less binding. It doesn't mean that the cells are not there. They will come back eventually. I mean, the regulation, it might become more upregulated later or not. It doesn't, but the point is that the function of these cells, the cells are still functional. But this is the kind of logic that has been used to talk about methamphetamine users and other drug users when we see these brain imaging pictures. Now, this is a PET image, but as you'll see, I also reviewed the literature with other types of imaging data, and I'll talk about that in a second. But before talking about that, one of the things I like to say is that this sort of logic that many of the researchers have been using provided also the evidence for them to say that methamphetamine users were cognitively impaired. And so one of the ways that I tried to just simply address this issue initially or early on was to, again, bring people into the lab and give the methamphetamine users a choice between drug, again, just like the cocaine study, the crack cocaine study, and money. But this time I thought that I would increase the monetary value to something like $20 to see whether or not they would take drug or money. And one of the things that we saw in this study was that when this is drug, when $20 was available, they almost never took drug, they always took the money. That's a rational sort of choice. And some people will say, yeah, they took your money because then when they left your lab, they wanted to go out and buy their own methamphetamine and get high, right? Some of you are smart enough to think that, right? Even if they did that, it required that they exercise some executive cognitive functioning, namely being able to inhibit, right? Inhibitory control, all of those sorts of things they had to engage in exercise. All of those sorts of things were said that they couldn't do. And so even if they went out and got high later, after they had completed the studies after weeks later, it still flies in the face of our sort of general thinking about these people in terms of their cognitive functioning. Well, I also published about a year and a half ago a major review, a critical review of the literature, the scientific literature that looked at methamphetamine and neuroimaging and as well as cognitive functioning. And the thing that I concluded in my review, after looking at all of the relevant papers, the thing that I concluded is that the methamphetamine users' cognitive functioning was overwhelmingly within the normal range when you control for age and education. Now, there have been some studies that didn't control for age or education. For example, there have been studies that compared high school graduates who used methamphetamine with non-users who had college degrees, and then they tested their cognitive functioning. Now, if college graduates, university graduates, do not outperform high school graduates on cognitive tests, those college graduates should get their money back because they got beat. That's inappropriate, but that's been happening. That happens in the literature. And then when you look at the brain imaging information, one of the things that you see is that if there was any difference between the two groups, the researchers had this propensity to interpret those differences as some indication of clinical abnormality or some pathology, even though differences do not equate to deficits or damage. But that's how it's been interpreted. Because if we image this side of the room, the left side of the room versus the right side of the room, we might see some difference. I'm pretty sure we will see differences. But people won't say that this side of the room is cognitively impaired versus that side of the room. But that's kind of what's been happening in the scientific literature when we think about people who use drugs, when they are compared or their performance is compared. And so this sort of thing is basically one of the things that we have participated in terms of science, as me as well, is that we've kind of misled the public. We've misled the public quite a bit about drugs. But not only us in science, a number of people mislead the public about drugs, politicians, even drug users, ignorant drug users. A number of people mislead the public about drugs. And so for me, one of the questions that I like to ask is like, well, why does this happen? Why is the public constantly misled about drugs? Why does this happen? Because if a behavior occurs regularly, it's serving some function. Trust me, it serves some function. I say that this is happening because I think it allows us to target people who we don't like and who we can't explicitly say we don't like. So if we don't like the group of people, it's not very sporting or polite to say you don't like, I don't like Muslims. That's not very polite. So we don't say that. Or I don't like black people. We don't say that. But we certainly can say we don't like an activity that is associated with them, and we can go after them. We can go after that activity. And indirectly, we get them. Another reason is that this has contributed, like people are fond of saying that the war on drugs has failed. That's such a lie. The war on drugs has been successful. It's been so successful. That's why it continues. It's been successful at increasing people's budgets, including mine. In terms of scientists, in terms of law enforcement, treatment providers, people who provide treatment, politicians, it has been hugely successful. So the notion that it hasn't been successful, it's just simplistic and wrong. Trust me, if it hadn't been successful, we would not still be talking about the war on drugs. Another reason is that it helps us to avoid dealing with real problems of poor people or people who are marginalized. if we say, like we said in the United States, crack cocaine is the problem, and I believed it, all we have to do is rid those communities of crack cocaine. We don't have to worry about the fact that 50% of the men in that community are unemployed. We don't have to worry about that. In fact, we don't even have to talk about it. Let's just get rid of crack cocaine. We don't have to talk about the substandard education. We don't have to talk about any of these sorts of things. We don't have to talk about poor nutrition. We don't have to talk about any of this. We can just deal with the drugs. And that's what we do. Now, the question for me then becomes, well, how's this done? How do I do it in my field? That's what you may ask. How do we do it as scientists? So one of the things that we must understand if we think about science, or scientists, or people like me, is that you have to understand that 90% of the world's research, of the entire world's research in this area on drugs of abuse, 90% is funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the U.S. National Institute of Drug Abuse. That's 90%. And that's a great thing at some level. But the thing that we have to understand also is that their focus is very narrow. Their focus is on pathology, the bad things that happens with drugs. They fund studies that look at the bad things that happen from drugs. So that means that when we think about it, when we think about this fact, the overwhelming majority of drug users, whether it's heroin, whether it's crack cocaine, whether it's marijuana, you name it, the overwhelming majority of those users use drugs without any of these problems, without pathology, without addiction, without these issues. Given that that's the case, and 90% of the world's research is funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which focuses on pathology, that means that you have a disproportionate focus on pathology. You have a disproportionate amount of information in the scientific literature about these drugs on pathology, on disease, on illness. That means that you have a disproportionate amount of the stories in your newspapers, in your novels, on your television programs, in your documentary films, in your other films. A disproportionate amount of information on pathology. And therefore, this is how you all are, we as a society are miseducated. Now this, coupled with the fact that scientists like me tend to err on the side of caution, and caution in this case means on the bad effects, we tend to err on the side of caution as if there are no consequences to erring on the side of caution. When in fact, there are, because it helps to create an environment where certain drugs are deemed evil, and any use of those drugs is considered pathological. So if someone is using heroin, they must be sick. Something must be wrong. We need to find out what happened in their childhood. Something must be wrong. And then we have this unrealistic focus on eliminating drugs at any cost. In the United States, we had these policies. I think they're still in place, actually, in name only, I think. These policies that we called, I think we called a drug-free America, a drug-free world. That is so ridiculous. Do you all get that? We have never had a drug-free world or a drug-free society, at least not while humans have been there. Humans have always used drugs. Humans will always use drugs. And you don't want to live in a world without drugs. Trust me. So when we think about science, I think about my role as a scientist and other scientists in this way. Our focus, well, here's an analogy. This is an analogy of us, if you lose your keys at night and there's a spotlight, you're more likely to look where the light is, even if your keys aren't there, because the light is shining there. I think about science in this way. The focus or the light is shining on pathology, and that's where we're looking. And it's like Upton Sinclair has said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. This is where we are in terms of drug abuse science. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as I think about science and the next book and all of these sorts of things, I think about, wouldn't it be good if we had, like we used to say back in the day, power to the people. Wouldn't it be nice if we could say science for the people? There is actually a radio show in Canada that is Science for the People, and they try to do this sort of thing. But currently, we don't really have science for the people in terms of drug abuse science, and we must understand that. And so the picture is kind of bleak if you are depending upon the interpretation of the scientists to help lead the way. The data themselves are pretty clear, but you have to actually do some work to understand the data, because the story that goes along with the data is oftentimes biased and distorted. So I don't want to be completely down on science, because science as an activity, I think it's a great way to understand or to know something. But I do want us to be cautious of the stories that are told by scientists. Now, and I don't want to leave you with just that bleak sort of outlook, because there are some things that we can do. I mean, one of the things that we can do, as I think about my own work, as I think about helping people and really improving people's lives, providing alternatives. I think that attractive alternatives. I think this is critically important. You can ask your society. As Sarah talked about, you all going to the politicians and talking to the politicians. By the way, Sarah, I wasn't sure who we were supposed to vote for, because it sounds like both of those. Tory? Oh, okay. All right. It sounded like both of those parties were pretty pathetic. But one of the things you can advocate for is that people have these attractive alternatives, because we know that attractive alternatives kind of help people to not overindulge in a pathological way in a variety of activities, not only drug taking, but a variety of activities. Attractive alternatives mean that people have meaningful employment, a wide range of things, but that requires work, and that requires some things that society seems to have been averse to previously. Another thing that we can do is we can start by making sure that we decriminalize all drugs. That means that people are not given criminal records or not subjected to criminal prosecution for being caught with drugs. This is the thing that I think that we should be advocating immediately. We can do this immediately. The Czech Republic did this in the 90s. Portugal did it in 2001. Both of those countries are doing well on all of the major drug indicators. They certainly are doing better than us in the United States and doing better than many of their European neighbors. And perhaps this sort of push for decriminalization will allow us to start doing some proper drug education. I have been studying drugs for about 25 years. And I have been giving drugs to people. I've given thousands of doses of drugs to people. Drugs like crack cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, you name it. Thousands of doses of drugs to people. Now, the most important lesson I've learned, in all of those cases, I've given these drugs without incident. The most important thing I've learned is that the most important thing is dose. Dose is critically important. If you are a novice, don't start off using drugs like a champion. Start off slow. All of these simple sort of messages we can communicate to society if we were more honest. But this is part of the public education. There are a number of sort of educational steps that we can do. I try to outline some of these in the book. But this is an important point. Decriminalization with corresponding amount of education. And perhaps this can be an intermediary step to drug legalization and proper regulation of the market. And one of the things that I like to encourage people to do as well is get out of the closet about your own drug use. I know with this group, I'm preaching to the choir. I know. I'm really talking to you and asking you to tell your friends and relatives and people who are doing well in life. Get out of the closet about your drug use. Because one of the things that has happened is that the narrative has been dominated by people who have problems with drugs. And that narrative is skewed towards pathology. And that narrative has given us an inappropriate and inaccurate view of drugs themselves. And so as you get out of the closet about your drug use and other people get out of the closet, one of the things they can also do including changing the narrative, but they can also play an important role as educators, telling people how to use more safely, showing them how to use more safely. Critically important. And finally, I want to come back to science because I was kind of hard on science. I want us to understand that we still need to trust the data. Not necessarily the story, but the data are critically important, because if you let the data dictate your position, you will end up in a humane place. You will. If you don't, then it becomes a matter of charisma, power, and all of those things that I don't have. And so the data are critically important. And I want to leave you all with a final thought, because as I talk about what these things that I kind of lay out as prescriptions or things I think that are important, I recognize that they are not easy things to do. It's not easy to come out of the closet about your drug use. It's not easy to advocate decriminalization, maybe legalization of drugs. I know that's not easy. I just want to take you all back to the 80s again, 1986. The reason why I keep harping on the 80s is because in the 80s, I used to hang out in Liverpool, and it was some of the best times of my life. I wasn't in the United States. Apparently, in the United States, they were catching hell about crack cocaine. They were really worried about this. This is a picture of presidential candidate Jesse Jackson. And in 1986, what he said about crack cocaine was that pushers, talk about the crack cocaine dealers, he called them terrorists and called them death messengers. And he said that dope is the hound of hell for this generation. He thought that this was awful. But he was in the majority in this sort of view. Most people felt like he felt. Certainly in the black community, they all agreed with him from this perspective. Now, there was one person who was not in agreement with Jesse Jackson, and that was the writer James Baldwin, the guy who I quoted earlier. James Baldwin, at this time in 1986, he was marginalized. He's a famous writer, important person in the 1960s, but by 1986, he had been marginalized. Nobody was listening to James Baldwin. And here's just what he said in 1986 about crack cocaine and other drugs he was saying. This is what he said.
To the heart of the dope problem, legalize it. That destroys the profit motive and may save our children. Nobody who has a habit who can afford it is going to go to jail. So it's a law which in operation can be used only against the poor. And a law like that is a bad law. And it has not stopped anybody from his fix. And it just puts some people in jail and some people under the ground because a whole lot of money is being made on the anti-dope law, which does not work. That is one of the things I think a black politician might suggest to white politicians, if you see what I mean.
You know, I watch this, and I go back and like read what he's written, and people. James Baldwin was at the position in 1986 where I just have arrived to after many, many years of studying this area. I feel stupid, but as I think about this, I am still alone. We are still alone, and so it's a difficult role for us. And as I think about being alone, I think about the words of another one of my favorite writers, Lorraine Hansberry. She wrote the play, the Raisin in the Sun, and she said that the thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is inevitably that which must also make you lonely. So I think about her words, and then I think about people like her and James Baldwin, who was isolated and marginalized towards the end of his life. Lorraine Hansberry, she died an early death at the age of 34, but she also felt lonely. But I also think about being here with you all today among my people, and I think about James Baldwin and this picture of James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry. They were having fun being alone together. And I hope that's what we can do here today. Thank you all.